Greetings and salutations. It is I, Mr. Nothing, the museum curator of the weird and the strange, and the host who might be a vampire. Welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the strange and unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels across Transylvania. Today I want to talk about a book that I read, one that you may have gotten a few hints about, judging by the title of this video, of course, but also what I just said. I am talking about a book that features, vampires and very helpful Dutchmen, which are very strange, and women that want to eat you. I am talking about Bram Stoker's Dracula. Book that I checked out from my library. Don't forget to patronize your local library. It's an interesting cover in terms of like they're at a graveyard, as you can see, and there's either shovels or stakes in a grave. Might be stakes, but it looks more like shovels to me. But it's a bit unclear. And then in the back there's a quote from the story. I feel like everyone is familiar with Dracula in some way. If you've literally ever heard of vampires, you probably know who Dracula is. Because, Dracula is one of the OGs. Something I found out in my research for this video is that Dracula wasn't the first vampire story. I actually thought it was because a lot of people prop it up as like a masterpiece or whatnot, and they're always like, oh, Dracula invented vampires, or give the impression at least that that's the case. But I found out that there were a bunch of like vampire fiction was already a thing by the time Dracula wrote this. Dracula is just like the one that got the most critical attention at a time when a lot of attention was starting to be placed on books and movies and stage and stuff like that. So maybe that's why it's propped up more so than the other stories. So I think this is an interesting story. Bram Stoker, he wrote Dracula, but he wrote it at 50 years old, which I just learned. He's if you ever feel like you haven't accomplished enough, just remember that Bram Stoker didn't write Dracula until he was 50, which is he was writing other stuff, but that's not as acclaimed, I would say, and not nearly as held up as some of his best work. So you just know that you probably won't be recognized for your greatness until you have a lot of stuff under your belt. And you should never feel like you haven't accomplished enough, I think is what I'm getting at there. Not much else to say about Bram Stoker besides the fact that he wrote for a British newspaper. Can't remember which one, probably put it up there. And he also was a film critic, a stage critic, drama critic. So he had that going for him as well. Pretty extensive career, and there's a reason we remember him. So without further ado, I figure I will talk about Dracula, a little summary, a little analysis, and we'll move on from there. So Dracula starts with the character of Jonathan Harker. Well, first I should note that it's written in epistolary format, so there's actually multiple protagonists, multiple people who are telling their side of the story through journal entries and newspapers, and letters to friends, etc., etc. So you get Jonathan Harker, his girlfriend / wife Mina Harker, Seward, who is a doctor, Abraham Van Helsing, a name that you might be familiar with. And a bunch of other characters as well. But it really starts off with Jonathan Harker talking about his visit to Transylvania. He is a solicitor, and he is helping a strange count and Count Dracula. He's helping him to finalize the details on his property buying in London. And he was sent in someone else's place. So this is where Jonathan Harker is. Dracula wants to buy the new house a bunch of new properties. He's very curious about how he would go about buying various properties and using multiple solicitors so that maybe there's no paper trail, and that should bring up a lot of questions for Jonathan Harker. But luckily, Jonathan is very stupid, so he's not asking those kinds of questions. The longer Jonathan stays at the castle, he begins to see some strange things happening. There's some mysterious ladies who try to eat him while he sleeps. He begins to notice that Dracula, he doesn't see Dracula during the day. The Count, he looks out his window and he sees the Count sneaking out of his window in a weird kind of way. And it's at this point Harker wants to leave, but Dracula doesn't let him. And when they finish the details of everything, Dracula decides to go to London, and he leaves Harker to be left at the castle to be eaten, vampirized by the mysterious vampire ladies who want to eat Harker. From there, the rest of the story, or a lot of the middle part of the story, is told from the perspective of different people. You have Mina, who is waiting anxiously to hear back about Jonathan Harker, although he hasn't really been communicating to her, especially as his stay in the castle grows more strange. And what's interesting is that Dracula told Harker to write several letters detailing when he was gone in order to cover his tracks, which is very smart on Dracula's part, and it's one of the things that Harker really worried about, why I'm doomed, I'm gonna die in this castle. So Mina doesn't really have correspondence, and she's starting to worry. At the same time, Seward, one of the doctors in the story, it comes into contact with a man named Renfield. Renfield is a mentally ill patient of his who is obsessed with spiders and bugs and all kinds of creepy crawlies. And throughout the story, you learn that Renfield is under the sort of hypnotism of Dracula to do his bidding, and I believe that eventually Dracula kills Renfield, but Dracula is able to do so much because he has Renfield's help, and Seward is studying him to really understand why. Why is this man acting so strange? But he doesn't have that vampire clue yet, so that's going on. And then there's also Mina is investigating the story of the Demeter, a ship which sailed into London but only had one person attached, the captain was attached to the helm, and all the sailors mysteriously vanished. With one sailor's log being that they saw something like a mysterious man in the night, and it seems like that mysterious man was picking them off one by one. And then you also have Lucy Westerna. Lucy is an interesting character. She is engaged to be married to Arthur Holmberg, I think. He's they're not together right now. He's off doing some business. But throughout the course of the story, Lucy begins to lose a lot of blood. And she becomes paler. And when she wakes up, Seward calls upon her and sees that, she's not doing too well. And I believe that Seward calls upon Van Helsing to figure out what's being done. And Van Helsing eventually figures out that some creature is coming in during the night sucking her blood, and so they do their best by doing blood transfusions, switching on and off each night that they find her like this. And it doesn't seem to matter what they do. They place garlic around her room at one point, but and even a crucifix. But some of the servants take those things, and it infuriates Van Helsing. But there's nothing they can seem to do about it. And over the course of the time, Van Helsing tells this to the others, but they still don't really do anything about it. And eventually, unfortunately, Lucy dies because, what got her drank all her blood, and they were unable to help her after that. Meanwhile, Jonathan finally makes it back to England, but Mina notes that he's kind of out of his mind, babbling on about, strange thin men, and, wild, crazy women that want to eat him. At the same time, a newspaper clipping reveals that there's the Bloofer lady who has been picking off children in the neighborhood, and Van Helsing and Seward kind of figure out that it's been Lucy who's doing that. So they go to her grave and they find out that she's missing from there, and so they wait until she comes back, and then they drive a stake through her heart, which kills her. Parker and everyone, they all gather together and they eventually piece together that Lucy was turned by a master vampire, and Harker reveals Count Dracula is probably that master vampire. So they all pledge to take down Dracula in any way that they can, which includes going around to all the properties he bought up and sanctifying the earth there so that he can't access those coffins anymore. And so he has to eventually return back to Transylvania. Dracula, figures all this out, and he's just really mad and angry and calls him a bunch of idiots. And he also attacks Mina a couple times, and so she has a sort of lesser version of vampirism where she's not a complete vampire, but the cross drives her mad, and she has an aversion to all the things that vampires do. So they have to race against the clock and rescue Mina by killing Count Dracula. Because they destroyed everything that Dracula had brought over from Transylvania, though, they have to go back to Transylvania because Dracula has fled back there on a boat, and so they all head back over the last 50 to 75 pages. It's very slow, and they're just talking at this point. But Dracula, they make it back to Dracula's castle, where Van Helsing manages to kill the three lady vampires, and they find Dracula's coffin being carried by some gypsy people, and in the ensuing fight, one of their friends dies, but Dracula also dies and in the process. So that's the end of that. Everything's good. And in the epilogue, it just details that everyone is happy and they live a good life, free of vampires and, creatures of the night. So in terms of analysis, there's a lot to talk about here. The first thing that I noticed that I liked was the underlying theme of vampires as a sort of rejection of God, and maybe an alliance with hell or Satan. The first thing that's obvious about it is how vampires do not like the sign of the cross. That sends them away, it burns their skin, and so since the sign of the cross is associated with God and Jesus, you figure that any creature that doesn't like that, has to have a strong aversion to God, or is probably not one of God's creatures. And again, vampires are undead, so since death is kind of the natural order of things, any creature that is undead is violating God's plan. So that's a pretty clear another clear example of how vampires are against God. And then there's a whole bunch of dialogue with the characters where they talk about how Dracula is a servant of Satan or something like that, or that God is on their side rather than Dracula's side, because they're working to right a few wrongs with how Dracula is. So again, you got pretty clear examples of how vampires represent anti-God or pro-devilry. I figure that's something that you see in a lot of vampire fiction. Vampires representing that they're more in line with Satan than anything else. Although that's probably changed recently, as vampires have become more sexy, or even Twilight-ish, and it's less that they're in league with the devil, and more that this is just another creature that God may have created in His spare time. So I really like that talk, and it seems like maybe this might have been his contribution to the vampire fiction, whereas he may not have invented a vampire, but he did create a lot of the lore around it. Another thing that I really love about this story is the beginning. Jonathan arriving in Transylvania, having a good time, enjoying the food, and then slowly discovering that his host, Count Dracula, is not who he claims to be, and is actually something much more sinister. Everything from like Count Dracula keeping him up late at night and then being like, oh, look at the time, it's morning, time to go to bed. And then Count Dracula kind of sneaking out his window and crawling away like some sort of weird creepy bug creature. It's pretty interesting, and it's really good, and I feel like it's major points to Bram Stoker for being able to create that sense of horror and creep factor that ultimately leads to Harker's story just abruptly ending and moving to Mina, and you're like, well, what happened to Harker? I hope he's okay. I hope they're able to find him. However, one point against the story is that it does get pretty slow after that. They spend so much time trying to figure out what's wrong with Lucy, even though the signs are pretty clear. And then as they're heading back to Transylvania, it takes so long. And the end of the story is just them staking Dracula and calling it a day. And there's so little time devoted to, the cool bits that they could have focused on. And instead just the traveling from England to Transylvania without much happening. And it kind of sinks the story a little bit, in my opinion. I was expecting a lot more from this, and after the beginning, it just became a little disappointing. The part with Lucy and them trying to figure out, what's the cause, that was a bit interesting, but it couldn't hold my attention really throughout the whole story, which is a little sad, and especially because I went into this ready to love it. There are also a couple of issues with this story. First, it's racist and misogynistic. And I know I don't want to be that guy who's constantly reading old stories and being like, this story is racist and misogynistic, because it's too late to, effectively hold that kind of conversation with Bram Stoker because he's dead. And everyone already knows that, those old-timey stories. But I feel like it has to be said just to get it out there. This story is, even on the Wikipedia page, it says it fits into the category of invasion literature, which is a genre I didn't know existed. Basically, pre-World War I, there was a lot of fiction out there that existed to be like, those weird Eastern European men are coming to steal our ladies, which is a trope that still exists in a lot of conservative circles, except it might be relegated to like African men or Middle Eastern men. So you got that with Count Dracula. Luckily, it doesn't really hold up to the other Transylvanians in the story, although there is a band of gypsies that are pretty much protecting Dracula, and they don't show up until the end, and so you're like, why did Stoker bring up this band of gypsies who are supposed to be the Roma? Let's call them the Roma. Gypsies is a slur, remember that. But why did he bring up this group? And just to have someone to protect it, they didn't exist before, and it feels like he's going out of his way to disparage an entire group of people by saying they're in league with vampires and possibly the devil. And then the story is misogynistic because it gives little for the women to actually do in any way of affecting the story, because Dracula hypnotizes Mina and he just kills off Lucy, unfortunately, before they can figure out what to do. And what's really weird is that at one point, I believe Van Helsing says that, or Seward says that Mina has the brain of a man. So, very clearly misogynistic, very much 1800s. Anyway, those were my thoughts on Dracula. Overall, I'd still say, despite the problems, I enjoyed the story, and it is worth checking out for mainly for that historical kind of landmark work and fiction kind of dealio. Definitely worth reading for fun. I wouldn't go out of your way outside of October maybe to find it. Maybe just watch the movie instead, or watch the superior movie Nosferatu, which was the German version that was kind of a bootleg and almost just got erased out of existence, but luckily somebody saved it. And I enjoyed Nosferatu, and I recommend you go watch that. after you get done maybe reading the book. If you have anything to say about Dracula or my thoughts on the book, feel free to comment below. I would love to hear from you and have a discussion about Bram Stoker or Dracula or vampires in general. Do you believe they should be sparkly? I'd love to have a discussion with you about that. Until then, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that we can get the good word of vampires out to the masses. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and blood-sucking travels. Farewell.